tonight, joining us will be Catherine Parsons, who's the director of Mass Audubon Shorebird Protection Program. Catherine will speak on her program's efforts in cooperation with many local partners to protect coastal birds at over 100 sites from Revere to Provincetown, and including Ellisville Beach and Shifting Lots. And also Paula Marcoux, who is a longtime member of the board of directors of the Friends of Ellisville Marsh, and also a dedicated shorebird monitor out at Shifting Lots, who will recount the melodrama that was the 2020 shorebird nesting season at the Shifting Lots Preserve. And Melf and I will be talking about how Shifting Lots Preserve has managed to protect the nesting endangered shorebirds, also minimizing the impact on our preserve visitors. So before we begin, I'm going to give a little talk about Wildlands Trust. And I'm just going to share my screen here. All right, can everybody see my screen? Give a thumbs up if your video is on, if you're a co-host. All right, perfect. So Wildlands Trust, our mission is that we work throughout southeastern Massachusetts to conserve and permanently protect native habitats, farmland, and lands of high scenic and ecological value in order to keep our community healthy and our residents connected to the natural world. And the area we serve, you can see on this map, it covers about 1,500 square miles, and we are active in over 40 towns, and have worked with, we have worked to protect about 10,000 acres. And our headquarters is down in southern Plymouth, off of formerly exit 3 on Route 3. And we have trails directly across the street from our office. So I encourage you to come visit at some point. And our work, mostly we do a couple things. Land protection, we protect land both for its natural and agricultural value. We've worked to protect about 10,000 acres. We directly, and we have a land stewardship department, which includes myself and one other full-time person. And we maintain our trails, keep them safe and accessible to the public. And we also have about 100 volunteers who are part of our Adopt a Preserve program, who help us monitor our trails and perform trail work. And so if this program sounds interesting to you, please feel free to reach out to me after the program. You'll see in the picture to the top right, that is a Adopt a Preserve volunteer working with me at our Hoyt Hall Preserve in Marshfield. So our volunteers get a lot of direct experience doing land management and trail maintenance. So it's something that is, if you're looking to get involved with our organization, it's a great way to sort of start. And we also have a variety of educational public programming, and we work with youth, and we do these programs across our region, and also often during pre-pandemic times at headquarters in Plymouth. And we try to connect with the residents of the South Shore in multiple ways through this programming. We try to have a diverse variety of programming. And our work we collaborate with towns, nonprofits, and state agencies, and we couldn't do what we do without our partners. And our members as well. Our members really make our work possible. You can, if you're interested in becoming a member, you can join at $50 a month, and you can find more info at that link below. And 100% of your support goes towards the protection and the stewardship of the land that we hold. So to our members, I thank you very much for your support over the years, and I hope to see some of you out on the trails. So without further ado, I'm gonna end my screen share here and pass the baton to Catherine Parsons, who will talk about the Shorebird Protection Program.
All right, thank you so much, Eric. Let me see if I can get this. Yeah, this is it. And from beginning. Okay, now sometimes my presenter view shows up. Eric, can you tell me if the right view is up? You're muted.
Currently, I can see your see your PowerPoint, but you're not in presentation mode yet.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's fine. That's great. Okay. Well, great. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Eric, the two Erics. It's a great pleasure, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share information about the Coastal Waterbird Program this evening, as well as all of the fantastic efforts, partners throughout the state. Lots of entities such as Wildlands Trust and the Friends of Ellisville Marsh have been doing for many years now to help the recovery of piping plovers and other vulnerable beach nesting birds. I guess we're going to go pretty much straight through and have questions at the end or through the chat. So we'll continue on in that vein. So just briefly, I'm going to give a little bit of information about the Coastal Waterbird Program. I hope there's some Mass Audubon members in the audience. And then again, talk about the success really that throughout the state, there has been amazing success in conserving and recovering beach nesting birds for a number of years. And then finally touch on the thing that's really staring us right in the face and certainly staring the beach nesting birds in the face, and that's the impacts of climate change and those potential losses that we're hoping to mitigate as we go forward. So the Coastal Waterbird Program is really part of Mass Audubon's legacy. Mass Audubon was started in the late 1880s by folks who were really distraught at the wholesale slaughter of seabirds and other birds for the millinery trade. I know
Catherine?
everybody's, yeah.
Catherine, it's Paula. You're not in presentation mode. We can just, we can see your
Okay,
entire task bar.
Sorry about that. Let me get out of that then. I think I can do that by, let me exit.
You were for a second at the beginning, and then something happened.
Oh, okay. So let me try it again.
Yeah, try from beginning again.
And then I swap. Now, what are you seeing?
Now you're back to that same your presenter mode, but not into presentation mode.
Okay, let me try again. Sorry about the problem here. How's that?
That's good.
Okay. Okay, well, great. Then let me keep going. There's one video that I want to make sure that I get correctly. And let me go forward. Okay. So I think I got to the part about Mass Audubon having a legacy. There we go. Yeah. Obviously, Mass Audubon started to protect coastal birds and was started in the late 1880s. And in the mid 1980s, the program that we have now is formalized with the listing of the piping plover under the Federal Endangered Species Act and also under the State Act. And the Mass Audubon logo actually includes the roseate tern, which is one of the species that's the focus of the Coastal Waterbird Program. The goals of the program are pretty straightforward. We're trying to protect rare coastal birds, special status birds and their habitats, and also the larger ecosystems in which they occur. And here's our cast of characters. I hope all of you are familiar with these birds. They're beautiful and they're so much a part of our seaside experience. A piping plover, let me see if I can get the pointer to work. Piping plover adult here, excuse me, and in flight. And then the chicks, which I hope you've seen on Shifting Lots, the least terns here with chicks and eggs and a larger tern chick. The American oystercatcher are not nesting anywhere too close to Shifting Lots to my knowledge. And then here's the beautiful roseate tern, which Mass Audubon's particular interest in the roseate tern is when they're staging, that is getting ready for migration on the Outer Cape. And the four ways in which the Coastal Waterbird Program works is really, I think are really key. They're like four pillars for our operation. So that includes on the ground management, putting up symbolic fencing, protecting the birds exactly where they are, but then also lots of training and outreach, working with young folks that are part of our staff, as well as college students and trainees. We do engage in a number of conservation science projects with academic partners, and all of that work is really directed toward management solutions and developing best practices for managing the birds on the beach, and also in sort of funneling right into public policy. So here's a shot of sort of the scope of the Coastal Waterbird Program and shows where we were active in 2020. So 182 beaches protected. That's about 50% of all the protected and reported beaches that are mapped under the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act in the state. So a really important and aspirational remit, I think, for the Coastal Waterbird Program, 130 plus miles of coastline. About 27% of all the piping plovers that nest in Massachusetts are protected by our staff and students, 44% of the Massachusetts least terns, and about a third of the American oyster catchers in the state. And you can see we're active farther north than Revere Beach and farther south than Provincetown. So all the way from Plum Island down to the Westport River and on the islands as well. And everybody's familiar, I think, with some of the problems that, that coastal birds, nesting birds in particular, face on our busy coastline. One of the things I think that's interesting is that piping plovers and American oyster catchers are two species of a relatively very small number of shorebirds that nest in temperate latitudes. So these birds are trying to nest exactly where all the people are. So there's a lot of sharing the beach. They're subsidized predators, unfortunately. We have raccoons and skunks, for instance, that take advantage of trash that's left on the beach, or even just trash barrels that are on the beach. And we have domestic predators like cats. And then, of course, you know, our non-resilient shorelines, unfortunately, a lot of the coast has been groined or seawalled or what have you. And so there's a lot of activity with the dynamic nature of the coast that's not working in the birds' favor. But on the right side, there's just amazing results from relatively unsophisticated management practices. And this includes putting up the symbolic fencing, which you're probably all familiar with. It's simply twine and signs on posts. Sometimes we use electric fencing, which is shown here. Sometimes exclosures are used, but that's pretty much as fancy as we get with, especially with piping plovers, where we have to be really careful with the management practices we're using. We don't want to cause more harm than good. I hope everybody can recognize this character here, but there's always an important emphasis on outreach to beachgoers and to the local communities. And that's something that over the years, it's become critical to spend time working on. The training and outreach has, especially over the years, has really generated a lot of capacity in local communities and actually ramifying out from Massachusetts, because a lot of the young folks that have gone through Mass Audubon's staff are now working as professionals, you know, beyond Massachusetts and in other areas of conservation. And we feel it's really been a privilege to have interacted with the lives of these 1,500 young folks that have worked on the staff or been students with us and have gone on to conservation, environmental education, policy professions and careers. And then the public outreach directly to school groups and to libraries and setting up discovery stations at some of the busy beaches, working with local landowners to erect more permanent signage, working on some of the busiest beaches in the state. This is Revere Beach, where on busy weekends where they have their sand festival weekend, they might have 500,000 visitors on that beach. So these are all places that are challenging, but also ultimately rewarding, I think, in how many people you can begin to educate and win support for the bird stewardship. I want to talk very briefly about one of our conservation science projects. Again, looping back to the roseate tern, we're primarily interested in them as staging birds on the outer Cape. You can see that they were endangered under the endangered species laws, listed as endangered, listed at about the same time as the piping plover. And you can see from this abundance graph that their fortunes have gone up and down. This drop that shows here was a result of Hurricane Bob. Then there was nice climbing, a sort of unexplained decline there, then stabilized and now increasing. So roseate terns are doing well in the state. And what we found in researching their staging ecology with academic partners and through a lot of banding of hatchier birds, so fledglings, as well as adults, breeding adults, is that up to 90% of the entire endangered West Atlantic population, Northwest Atlantic population, actually leaves their breeding colonies, and there might be 20 of those throughout the Gulf of Maine, all the way down to Long Island Sound. They actually come south or they come east, And they stage in large flocks on these outer Cape beaches and on Nantucket in large, large numbers, tens of thousands of birds, mixed in with common terns, of course. But what we have here are parent chick or parent hatch year couples that come out together. Usually it's the father bringing out maybe one fledgling, sometimes two will fledge, in which case the female will accompany the other bird. But in any event, you have these parent chick couples, and the chicks in the first parts of staging are left on the beaches in flocks, and the adults go off and forage on their own and bring fish back to the young, excuse me, that are left on the beach. So in working with our reciting work and developing best practices, it's important that disturbance sources such as vehicles or dogs or other things are not disturbing these flocks where the adults might be separated, hopefully not, but possibly permanently from their hatch year who still hasn't figured out how to fish yet. So I can't spend too much time on the roseate tern projects, but it's an example of us doing some conservation science work with partners to inform public policy and develop best practices for protection. And then finally, and I'll talk a little bit more about this at the very end, that our work in public policy is increasingly focused on advocating for green, climate smart shoreline management. So this is an example of a site that we monitor in Barnstable, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go on as well, but lots of habitat restoration and strengthening of the coastline to protect private property interests is something we're going to see more and more of. So a couple slides about our flagship species, the piping plover. As everybody knows, I hope everybody is at least a little familiar with these little guys. They're really plucky. It's a small migratory species that nests from North Carolina all the way up to the Maritimes of Canada. As I mentioned before, it's one of only a few shorebirds that nests right amongst us. Most of shorebirds, as many of you may know, nest up in the Arctic and are kind of out of harm's way. But they're on habitats and on specific beaches that are shared with up to hundreds of thousands of beachgoers. So there's some great challenges there. They lay their eggs directly on the sand. There's no lining in their nest. Their young hatch and feed themselves within 24 hours of hatching. So they're not being fed by the adults, although the adults do stay with them. They brood them, they tend them, they draw them away from danger. They lead them down to good foraging areas. There's a lot of parenting going on, but they're not feeding them directly. The young have to find their own food. And one of the exciting things and interesting things about piping plovers is that, and something that makes them vulnerable, is that they're actually a nesting habitat specialist, but they specialize in a very dynamic ecosystem. So they require these large overwash areas where sand is buried some vegetation and made the landscape more, or the microhabitats more have sparser vegetation, which is what they prefer. And this kind of dynamism in the shoreline creates foraging opportunities for piping plovers that are really essential. So these are all important things to keep in mind in our coastline, which is increasingly being engineered. So I'm gonna get out of this, if I can briefly, and just give you a little glimpse into plover family life. This is a male piping plover. He's creating a nesting scrape. It's a potential place where the female may lay her eggs. He's really undergoing sort of stereotypical courtship work. This is a fanning display. The female has come in and is like inspecting the scrape to see if she likes it. And he may create several scrapes within their territory before she decides which ones she wants to lay her eggs in. They're both sort of flinging around little pieces of shell, and that's also part of this display. And all of this activity is important to keep the birds, to have their pair bond formed and strengthened, actually having those displays. We sometimes get property owners or folks that are like, well, it's just a scrape, the eggs aren't there yet, but it's important that the scrapes are not disturbed. You never know which one is going to be the best one, and part of creating these scrapes is keeping those pair bonds nice and strong. I wanted to give you a quick little story about this bird, which I think is so exciting, and I know you all had a banded bird on Shifting Lots last year. When you have a banded bird, it just makes it all so much more personal and exciting to see their victories and their disappointments, which sometimes happen. But in any event, this bird black flag over orange over light blue, and the right leg was white. So we called her Beulah. She was banded in the Bahamas in 2010 in the winter. And then she nested immediately that spring in 2010. And she was last known to be nesting in the Buzzards Bay area, mostly on Falmouth beaches in 2019. And she really had a remarkable career. She made 8 round trips to the Bahamas. She was seen down there multiple times and sometimes en route. And she produced 12 fledglings that were protected by Mass Audubon, but in partnership with a number of different Falmouth communities and beach associations. So it's just a wonderful example of one bird that, you know, definitely replaced herself in the population and did much more than that. So if we look at how piping plovers have done in Massachusetts with intensive protection and habitat management, they've increased more than 5-fold. They've gone from about 130 pairs per 130 pairs in the state at listing in the mid 1980s to over 800 pairs last year. And this red line is showing what their productivity is looking like over time. And this is essentially the average number of chicks fledged per pair per year. And that's relatively stable. It's not quite as high as we might expect it to be to have that growing population, but it's an interesting demographic question to know exactly what productivity level we're actually shooting for each year. But in any event, the good news is that we're producing lots of plovers, and we have a lot of plovers nesting in Massachusetts. Now moving to the least tern for just a couple of slides. Again, this is a species that's listed not federally, but only under the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act as a species of special concern. And there are about 40,000 of them in the entire Atlantic coast population at last count. They're a little difficult to keep track of because they're pretty dynamic in their use of the habitat. But in Massachusetts, they're doing reasonably well. And I know you had some nesting at shifting lots this past year and have had them in the past as well. Oh, and here's another little view into, let me see if I can do this, family life for least terns. This is on a beach in Yarmouth. And you can see there are 2 little chicks there. They have a somewhat different plumage. And then, oh, there's a 3rd chick. That's a little bit unusual. Usually we have 2 chicks or 2 eggs, but sometimes there's a 3-egg clutch. Here comes the adult. It's not clear. It's not always clear, the male from the female for least terns. There may be some fantastic birders that can figure this out, but we know it's one of the parents. And the least terns are different than the piping plovers in that these chicks all require being fed. So they're going to stay on the beach and wait for mom or dad to come back with a little fish and take care of them. They're going to brood them the way this adult is brooding its 3 chicks. So they're a little vulnerable in that respect as well, because they're always going to be waiting for the adult to come back, and feed them. And then very briefly about American oyster catchers, which are just fantastic birds. I would love it if you had them nesting in your marsh. It probably wouldn't be safe for them, but they're just fantastic to see. And they're very similar in some respects to piping plovers. They actually kind of split the difference a little bit in terms of foraging and parental care. So they lay their eggs directly on the sand the way both species do, least terns and piping plovers. But they feed their young quite a bit until they're large enough to wander around and begin foraging on their own. So they do parental care that's a little bit different and in more specifically for feeding than piping plovers do. And then just some interesting information about urban nesting American oyster catchers. This is one of the fun things that the Coastal Waterbird Program is studying. We're doing quite a bit of work in Boston Harbor, and here's Boston Harbor here. And all of these sites are where American oyster catchers are nesting. And if you look at this graph, you know, since the mid 1980s, American oyster catchers have leveled out over the past 20 years or so at about 200 pairs. So that's the state population. But what's been increasing, so interestingly, is that the percentage of the state population that's nesting in Boston has been increasing, and it's now up to about 18%. So, giving that a little bit more, almost 20% of all the American oyster catchers in the state are now nesting in Boston Harbor, which is pretty remarkable. All right. So just a little summary slide. I think the great news for Massachusetts and all of the partners, such as Wildlands Trust and Friends of Ellisville Marsh, working with town groups and beach associations and all kinds of people who are invested in the success of these birds, have had this incredible success. Five-fold increase for piping plovers. That's just so remarkable. Going from a few pairs of American oyster catchers to 200 pairs, and a threefold increase in least terns. I think that the coastal communities and the visitors to the coast that Massachusetts hosts every year have to take a lot of credit for allowing this success to be, and in many cases, fostering it. It's really an amazing success story. But now, climate change. This is such a difficult thing for all of us, but especially for beach nesting birds. It exacerbates a lot of the problems that the birds are facing already. So with a very narrow beach, because it's eroded, the birds want to nest, somewhere along the toe of the dune or out on a berm if it existed. But with narrow beaches like that, the impacts of tidal overwash, the impacts of predators that walk along the edge of edges, like a coyote, for instance, their ability to find and eat eggs and chicks is so much enhanced by narrow beaches, and also, of course, human disturbance. It's very difficult to provide space for piping plovers and little chicks and what have you when everybody's competing for the same narrow strand. So this is really, obviously, this is a huge concern for all of us. And in the Coastal Waterbird Program, we're desperately trying to figure out ways that we can mitigate some of these cascading impacts due to erosion and storm effects and what have you, sea level rise. One of the things we did was to say, okay, we've got this big thing coming at all of us and at the birds that we are trying to protect. If we had to pick the best sites to protect, what would those be? Not that we would really ever take that approach, really, because we want to protect them wherever they want to be. But we went into our big database, our 30-year database, and we tried to identify what you might be able to call hotspots, or what I call high-performing beaches. And what this index does, this cumulative pair index, it looks over time for the amount of time a beach was in use by piping plovers, since listing, basically. So we have some beaches that have been used consistently every year for 25 years, and that's what the dots over here are. So each dot is a different beach, and Shifting Lots is in here someplace. And the index is actually a combination of the longevity of use, the number of pairs, so sort of the occupancy rate, as well as the number of young that were produced. So it's kind of an overall index of how good a beach is. And essentially, if we look at the trend line here, we're looking at the average within this group of beaches. So some are better, some are worse. The average is where that trend line is. And if you look at the ones that are not doing well, these are the underperforming beaches. We notice that they are in the long range group of beaches. So they're beaches that have been used for a long time, probably since the birds were listed. So maybe for 25 or 30 years. And those beaches all have inlets. Inlets are really key places for beach nesting birds of many different kinds. Inlets have a lot of energy. They bring in a lot of nutrients. There's a lot of exchange of waste, and anyway, they're just highly productive. Inlets are fantastic, and birds love them. But if you have a structured inlet, like these beaches that are in this circle all have structured inlets. They have jetties or some kind of engineered structure at the inlet, and that seems to be a common trait of our underperforming beaches. Our highly performing beaches, the ones that are above the trend line, are all of these wild beaches that have inlets. All of these beaches at this end of the spectrum have inlets associated with them. This is Monomoy, this is Allen's Pond. So they all have inlets, but they're untrammeled. They do not have any engineered structures on those inlets. And I think that's just a really interesting trend. And if we find Shifting Lots, we can see that it's one of those sites that has only been in continuous use for now it probably has been about 20 years, because I did this a number of years ago. It's above the line, so that's fantastic. And we're rooting for Shifting Lots every year going forward, of course. And then one more thing to think about with climate change, and that is the percentage of eggs that are lost as a result of overwash or flooding. So these are tidal impacts or a little bit of wind or a king tide or what have you. Usually this is quite variable. It's increasing over the past 5 or so years, but it will vary between, say, 15% and about 40%. In 2017, it was a particularly bad year, and we lost 38% of all the eggs that were laid by piping plovers in our sites to overwash. And then finally, I think I'm coming right down to the end. This again is a site that we're monitoring and helping to protect. It's a big restoration project on Dead Neck Sampson's Island between Cotuit and Osterville on Cape Cod. Nesting abundance since this part of the island has been renourished. And there are other habitat restoration areas on the island that are farther to the west. So nesting abundance has doubled for piping plovers. We've gone from 8 pairs to 16 pairs. 2 least tern colonies have come in, which are new, as well as nesting by American oystercatcher for the first time since 2012. So it's been a great success in attracting the birds in. We're also doing prey studies on the island. We're looking at the invertebrate population that is in these these renourished areas, and making sure that we understand whether renourishment is actually a plus or a minus for the prey populations. It certainly is a plus in terms of creating nesting habitat for the birds to place their nests. So what's been the recipe for success? We think it's been essentially, partnerships for sure. Our management is based on science. Working with next generation conservationists has been great because our impact has gone on to many other parts of the state. We're protecting about 50% of the sites in the state directly, but our staff have sort of graduated from us and gone on to take on jobs with other towns, with other organizations. And so the Mass Audubon Way, which I like to call it, is now being used in about 72% of all the nesting beaches in the state. So we're really pleased about that and feel like we're part of a great network of people who are working for these shorebirds and their habitats. Outreach and advocacy is important. And then again, really engaging with local communities and understanding how to make things work together. And I don't think we don't even need to go over this. I'm probably over time. Everybody I think on this call knows that by obeying beach rules, especially with regard to dogs, it's just key. More and more research is being done that shows that there are very clear metabolic costs to the adult birds in particular from the stress of having dogs anywhere near their beach or their nesting area. So dogs are a problem, and we always ask our staff to find out where the other places are near the beaches that they're protecting, where dogs can be walked. Just about everybody loves dogs, but those are really tough things for the shorebirds to manage. Staying out of fenced areas, that's really not a problem. In most cases, we almost never have people in the fenced areas, which is fantastic. In Massachusetts, we've been doing this for more than 30 years, and most people know what the fences are all about. So it's been great to see that there's a lot of compliance with that. And then I'll just leave with this great image. Beach stewards, and this is, I think, just typical of the way it's worked in Massachusetts. These 3 folks right here self-selected to kind of make way for ducklings for a little plover family that was in this dune, and every so often on this busy weekend day would march out and get down into the wet sand and forage in the rack line and down in the water. And these folks would see them coming, and they would, ask people to move their blanket or just be aware of them coming through and allow them to get into the foraging habitat. And we see this more and more. 90% of our interactions with the public are positive, and people are interested in knowing, and they're rooting for the success of these little birds that have shown that they can make it work. Excuse me, and the local communities can make it work also. So I'm very optimistic. Climate change is a big bear, but we're learning more about it and working with those interventions that are coming down the pike for our coastline. And I'm looking forward to your questions at the end. I'm afraid I might have gone over a little bit, so I think I'll close now.
All right, thank you, Catherine. That was excellent.
Okay, good. Now let me get out of here somehow. Did I? No. I need to unshare, or maybe you can unshare me.
Yeah, let me give that a try.
I'm not seeing, oh, good. I think you did it.
Excellent. Let me get to my current slide here. All right, excellent. So I'm going to give a little background into our Shifting Lots Preserve in Plymouth, and then some of the different things we do to try to protect the least terns and the piping plovers that we have nesting there most summers. And some of the second half of my talk will be sort of information that Catherine covered already. And some of the information about shifting lots, I know many of you are from Plymouth and live in that general area, so that will be all things you know as well. So I'll try to be brief, but paint enough of a picture for those who have not been to shifting lots so that they sort of can wrap their head around what it is like to be out there. So our Shifting Lots Preserve was donated to us by Albert and Laura Marsh, Donald Quinn, and Ruth Lapham back in 2003. And it's a 45-acre coastal property with beach frontage, and it's surrounded by development in southern Plymouth. And Shifting Lots is our only coastal property that we maintain for public access. I think that's important to point out. Most of our other coastal properties that we have in our portfolio are predominantly salt marsh. It's our only property that is a barrier beach. So with that, it's our only property with the beach access that the public is using. And the beach supports the two birds that have been mentioned, and that's pretty much on a yearly basis. Both the least terns and the piping plovers tend to nest on the northern part of the preserve, right near where the inlet is, between the little tidal creek that is between Ellisville State Park and Shifting Lots. And you'll see some pictures that will give you some context on that shortly. The majority of the acreage of Shifting Lots is salt marsh, and that salt marsh is continuously at threat during winter storms. And as the sands shift, that tidal inlet tends to get clogged up with the sand. So that area, that channel is dredged by the Friends of Ellisville Marsh to maintain that marsh habitat every few years. And so I'm going to now bounce to my next slide. So here is a map of our Shifting Lots Preserve. This is the map that you'll find both out at the preserve in our kiosk and also on our website. As you can see, the state park directly abuts us to the north, and our little parking area is there off Salt Marsh Lane. And there's sort of a little trail loop you can do to hike there. There's a established trail that you can hike on the backside of the dune out to the Tuttle Creek, and then do a loop back around on the beach. So it's a nice property to visit for sure. I would definitely recommend checking it out during times when you can drive and park in the parking lot, which I'll talk shortly about.
Hey, Eric, you're also not in presentation mode, so we're not seeing your current slide come up.
Gotcha. All right, I will see if I can. I'm going to stop share and start again as well. Okay. Can everybody see that?
You're still in presenter mode, not in presentation mode.
Okay, I'm going to stop my share again. All right, is that better?
Yes, that's great.
All right, perfect. So I have some photos here of that were taken out at our Shifting Lots Preserve to sort of give anyone who hasn't been to this property a general idea of what it looks like when you're there. So the photo on the left, that was taken from our parking area, and that's the gate that is in front of the path that goes out behind the backside of the dunes to the Tuttle Creek. And then the picture on your right is a photo of the mouth of that tidal creek that is between the Ellisville State Park and Shifting Lots. And Shifting Lots also, interesting fact, the name is not, at first when I started with the trust, thought it was because of the constant changing of the sort of the beach area and the shifting of the sands. And I was actually pleasantly surprised to learn from Eric Cody that it was actually indeed that they harvested the salt marsh grass, and the lots of the farmers rotate it or shift it every now and then. So that was an interesting fact that I did not know. So moving on. This photo to the left here is if you're standing at our parking lot and you're looking out towards the beach, that's the path that goes out towards the beach. Then you'll see another photo of the Tidal Creek looking west, I believe. And then here's just another nice photo of the Tidal Creek. And to the right is a picture of that path that goes along between the Tidal Creek and the backside of the dune. All right, so you might be asking why there's a photo of a vehicle, a municipal vehicle out at a beach at sunset. So to give you context of my sort of where I got started with, I would say beach management, I worked for the town of Dennis Department of Natural Resources for 2 summers. And we managed 2 off-road vehicle beaches in Dennis, Chapin Beach and Crow's Pasture. And at Chapin Beach in particular, we had piping plovers. So we, depending on where the plovers were at and whether they had eggs or not, or whether they even showed up, we would be closing the beach down to off-road vehicles and also changing our rules on dogs depending on whether the plovers or also terns occasionally were there. So I got some experience both being ready to constantly sort of shift and adapt our management strategies depending on where the birds went or moved, and also talking to beachgoers with when you're putting signs up, not allowing dogs at a beach that is a very popular dog walking beach, and sort of got first learned how to talk to people about this. And often it was early April, which is the same thing at shifting lots when the birds first arrive. That's when you sort of start to catch people off guard, and they're used to walking their dogs on the beach, and the rules suddenly change, and you go into, you learn how to talk to somebody and sort of use it as a teaching moment. So that was a great first experience. Also West Dennis Beach, we also managed protected the shorebirds there as well. So I've been with Wildlands Trust for about 6 years. And so going from the town of Dennis, a municipal beach, to a much smaller property that is still heavily used in the summer, even and has a lot of the same challenges, but be it at a much smaller scale. The challenges we face, which I know Catherine covered a lot of these. Probably the most common one that any beach is trying to manage is dogs on the beach, and that's often early April is when that is the most challenging moment in time. And at first, when I first started with the trust, when you went to talk to somebody and ask them to leave the beach with their dog, you would always give them an alternative. We have many properties in Plymouth that we allow dogs at all of them year round. So I would always try to direct people to either a beach I knew that allowed dogs or one of our properties. And at first, I think people sometimes are caught off guard, and you just have to, if someone reacts in an angry way, just talk calmly, and usually that you can de-escalate a situation pretty quickly. And also off-road vehicles, not as much what you would think like in other places. It's not vehicles driving out on the beach, but at shifting lots, we occasionally face issues with ATVs and dirt bikes. And that was especially most recently. So we had to put up some additional posts between gaps in our gate to try to dissuade this use. But that's something that can be a challenge, specifically there. Foot traffic on the beach and fireworks, especially around the 4th of July. We try to make a heavy presence over that weekend. And the 2 things that are a lot harder to manage, natural predators and the astronomical high tides, especially we've been seeing happen more and more often. So some of the things we do to try to manage the public use of the property, as we all know, beaches are heavily used in the summer, and many beaches have these threatened species nesting on them. So we're trying to balance both allowing the public to use our property and also trying to protect the threatened species that we have an obligation to protect on our property. So one thing we do is we close our entry parking lot gate at May 15th through September 15th during these peak visitation times to try to cut down on the amount of foot traffic that comes into there. We do still allow the public to use our property. We allow people to get dropped off at the gate, and also you can park at Ellisville State Park, and often at lower tides cross that tidal creek to get over to shifting lots. So it's still perfectly accessible, and even despite even the gate being closed on a 4th of July weekend, it's not uncommon to see close to 100 people on the beach. So we want the public to enjoy our property, but we also try to protect the species that are sensitive that are on the property. Some of the other things we do is, like Catherine mentioned, we install symbolic fencing. The fencing around the nesting areas is often installed, most of the time installed by Eric Cody and the Friends of Ellisville Marsh. Over the last 2 years, we started putting up symbolic fencing in front of the toe of the dune on the front of our beach, the whole length up until the nesting area. And we did that as sort of an experiment to see if we could reestablish some of the beach grass on the beach. And we've seen the beach grass sort of encroaching towards the high tide mark, which is, and seen that dune sort of revegetating, which has been exciting to see. But this fencing we often put up right around now. I was actually just out there the other day, put up that fencing to the right. And we usually take it down in October before the winter storms, because otherwise we would lose it. Occasionally this fencing does get taken down either by high tides or also by a random unknown cause, but we, with our volunteers, keep that fencing maintained. And we also have, so the kiosk has come a long way, believe it or not. It still sort of looks pretty minimalistic, as you can see. And we have some educational material in that kiosk and about the nesting shorebirds and the importance of protecting them. And also and why we don't allow dogs on the beach during these summer months. We actually are going to be, if you've ever been to our headquarters at Davis Douglas, we have this beautiful printed kiosk panel that we're planning on by the end of the year, having a similar printed panel, both about the history of Ellisville Harbor, and also half of it will be about the shorebirds. And so it'll be much more visible, look better, and be much more inviting. So we're hoping signage is one of the things we do to try to educate beachgoers and users of our preserves. And we're hoping a newer kiosk will help towards those efforts. And some of the other things that we really couldn't do what we do without both our partners, the Friends of Ellisville Marsh, who do the majority of the piping plover and least terns nest monitoring multiple times a day throughout the entire summer. And also with Mass Audubon's help, we as a full-time staff of only 2 people, and we have about 42 properties that are open to the public and have some type of public access, which also are very heavily used during these summer months. We couldn't do what we do without our partners being out there, watching the birds. As you'll hear, Paula is going to talk about some cover sort of recap the 2020 season very dramatically, which was an amazing season and very noteworthy. And so without the partner organizations, we couldn't do what we do. Both my fellow coworker, Owen Gray, who's our only other stewardship staff member, and myself, we do what we can on the weekends and throughout the week. And we also have 5 Adopt a Preserve volunteers who are out there throughout the summer as well, who have adopted shifting lots. So without this sort of community effort, we wouldn't be as successful as we've been. And in the past 6 years, really it's pretty rare that I run into a dog walker or anyone doing anything wrong, which it was much more common 5 years ago. So I think that's just a testament to everyone's efforts. And when we were out there installing the fencing yesterday on the dune fencing, I was installing it with a volunteer, and we had 3 different people come up to us and thank us. So seeing that shift over the past couple of years has been very rewarding, and also the success of the nests that we have had. I believe that's my last slide. So Paula, I'm going to end my share and introduce and let you take over here.
Okay, I'm hoping. Ah. Mm. Are you seeing that? Great. So it's a privilege to be here in such great company as a mere volunteer. But I've done this for very many years and seen a lot of amazing things on this beach, and that itself has been a privilege to spend sometimes several hours a day, several days a week, looking at a fairly small number of birds. Unlike, Catherine deals with them in the hundreds. Um, we have, because Ellisville Beach is pretty small, only a few pairs to deal with at a time. This is the bird's eye view. And here you can see that within the high tide line, there's really not a ton of breeding habitat. There are these areas here that are suitable for the plovers, as Catherine was describing. And above that, you wind up with too much vegetation and lots of predators that use this as a kind of a highway. And then below that, you have threats of overwash. So these birds have to sort of figure out where they can nest that will be safe. In prior years, we used to see a lot more nests, both to the north and to the south down the beach, but as Catherine described, the beach has gotten narrower and narrower and steeper as a result of the sea level rise. So we haven't had birds nest to the south of the beach of this area for years now. This is a sort of more bird's eye view. When you're looking for a breeding habitat, you look for the areas that are level-ish and not too far, but not too close to the dune, sometimes in very sparse vegetation, and not too far from the food. The food is off the edge of the water generally, and whether it's a tidal pool or the beach, in the wet sand or the mud. And this is the prime breeding habitat. It looks like a big expansive desert right here, but it's really not very large. This is more plover eye view here. And this is their primo area. It doesn't look really very and very pleasant for humans, which is good because it keeps people from going through there any more than they need to. And gives them more room, which they really need to be able to breed. There's a plover in this shot, but you don't have to necessarily see it. I sort of took this picture so that I'd have a record of where it would be. Or where it was looking at nesting. Here's a couple of them foraging, and this is one of the things that's great about Ellisville is that there's seems to be plenty of invertebrates and other goodies down in the muck and mud, and they don't seem to be as challenged by feeding themselves as they are by locating a nest sometimes or finding the right place, especially if there's a lot of pairs. These are least terns. They're also, you can see that on the right-hand side, that pair is feeding themselves. Well, actually, the male is trying to impress the female and try to get her to agree to start a family with him. And so he's got a fish that he's sort of dangling in front of her in an alluring manner. And you can see how handsome they are, that photo on the left. They don't tend to blend in quite so much as as piping plovers do. They tend to both stand taller and not really try to hide themselves. However, their eggs are pretty hidey. You can see it's just a little dish on the ground and a little one egg in the center of it. And they tend to nest on this spit that divides the sort of tidal pool from the actual beach on the other side of it. There's like a gravel ridge on top of it that they seem to like a lot. And that's all nice, except at very high tides. And we've had the tidal overwash issues that both Eric and Catherine have spoken about. So in this talk, I'm mostly going to talk about the novel and exciting things that happened last year, rather than the sort of what's the normal day-to-day or year-to-year ways that we like them to breed and so it started out in a very good way with having someone show up that we'd never seen before who was conveniently wearing a name tag. So this is 36P because of having this nice tag with a little bit of communication. I was able to learn that this bird had fledged the year prior at Cape Hatteras. He showed up a little bit after a couple other pairs started jockeying for position down the beach, the area that I was just showing you, the prime spot. But instead of going to that prime spot, which is over this way, he instantly, from the very first time we saw him, had sort of picked out this area. And within a day or two, he's actually in this shot right there. Within a day or two, all of a sudden, there's a female with him. And within another day or two after that, there were 2 eggs, and they started incubating them when there were 3 eggs. And the next thing you know, there were 4 eggs. So they were right on schedule. They just did everything right according to the book. And here's 36P in incubation mode, just sort of socked right down over the eggs. And, you know, he was completely an overachiever from day one in that his mate would also incubate the nest. It's normal for them to both do so, but he seemed to want to do it all the time. And that, you know, 9 times out of 10, when I would go to the beach, he was the one on the nest, and my co-monitors found the same thing. We would see her on the nest sometimes, but generally he seemed to be really into incubating. This is, I believe, the mate. So this, at least you get to see her, and 4 chicks, which you have to look hard to see. This is just after, not too long after that hatch. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. They've been hatched not very long before, and close to the nest only for a very short time. As soon as they hatch, they need to be brooded. So she'll sort of, she or he would cover them up and keep them warm. But then right away, like Kathy said, they start going off on their own and learning how to feed. Then they get chilly again and they look for parent. This is 36P, spreading himself out as fat and fluffy as he can possibly be. And I believe all 4 chicks are wedged under him in that photo. I can see 6 or possibly 7 legs, but it's very common for them to, especially when they're really young and small, to want to get under the parent as soon as they start to get a little bit of a chill. And sometimes they'll split up so that each parent gets maybe 2, which is more reasonable than trying to cover up 4. But when they're little, they are able to cover them up. Here's a closer shot of one of the chicks, just so you can see how super cute they are, and just how all legs and just crazy looking they are when they're little. They can run incredibly fast and, you know, start feeding themselves, just pecking around the sand just as soon as they get out of the egg about. And, you know, you can see him very well and just think, well, you know, why don't I see him like that when I'm at the beach all the time? All he has to do really is turn sideways and take 1 step away from you, and he begins to disappear. You can see how cryptic he is already, and the white begins to sort of disappear into the whiter stones, and the dark into the darker stones, and suddenly it's harder to see. And then in this shot here, we're not that far away, but they're all 4 chicks are in this shot. For those of us that are monitors and going down to the beach every day, we need to count them. And it's great when they're all together like this, but typically they'll split up with the parents, and just counting them can be a real challenge. This is not the sharpest picture, but it was one of the few I had with all 4 in it. So you can see all 4 of them, and you can see that's 36P, as usual, doing the overachieving, amazing parenting that he just did. So I'm going to leave them for a while. You can see this is a really kind of good plover's eye view of the beach also. We're in the breeding habitat and looking toward the feeding habitat. And I'm going to return to, I think, I have a couple more chick shots because they're just so cute. They're, again, not the sharpest, but you can just see some of their crazy behaviors. They're learning right away how to stretch their wings and, you know, get some flying practice in there. And the other one is could be either looking up for hawks, which is a posture they use sometimes when there may be an avian predator, but it could be looking down at a sand flea with the other eye. It's really hard to say, or maybe it's just doing yoga. I don't really know, but it's just they're just so cute that it's hard to deal with them sometimes. This is another novelty for us this year. This is a killdeer that's not an endangered or threatened species, but it's the first time in my many years, several decades of doing this, that we've had them nest on the beach. So right away, there were two pairs that started just doing exactly the same behaviors that we're so familiar with our piping plovers. And it was really fascinating to see another species of another plover, but more of an upland plover, sharing the beach, or maybe crowding the beach, but really using the same behaviors. You can see how striking and beautiful it is, not as shy as plovers. They also carried out the same behavior in terms of distraction display as well. That one that looks like it's completely contorted over there, it's flopping on the sand. They unfortunately nested quite close to where you have to walk to go to look at the other nests. And so we try to do everything we could not to disturb them. But when they feel threatened, they try to draw you away from the nest by flopping around like they have broken wings, or just that they're having a nervous attack of some kind, just to draw you away from the nest. And you can see that the nest, very similar to a plover nest, is the 4 pointy eggs with pointy ends inward, making a perfect nest in a cup of stones in this case. But it's quite interesting to watch their life going along the same way as the plovers do. And they're striking looking birds, but once they set down in the rocks like that, they're pretty hard to see still, even though they're so stripy. They just mixed in with everything else on the beach, and you could accidentally get pretty close to them without seeing them if you weren't careful. Okay, we had, as I mentioned, a couple other pair of plovers that got there early and were on the prime sort of nesting area and kind of jockeying for position on it. I know this is hard to see, but there's actually a couple eggs in the middle of the shop, and then left it large like this. So you can see that when we're looking for eggs and tracking the birds around, it can be very difficult to see them. And that's why there's a very large string around the area that they're in, because it's very hard to avoid if you're not just extraordinarily careful, accidentally stepping on them. So we move around extremely carefully when we're looking for them and when we need to count things, and also trying to not to disturb the birds. We wait until they're not present on site. There it is. And there they are a little bit closer, but there's 2 eggs there. And right away, a female plover started incubating these nests, these eggs. And that's all great, at 2 or 3 eggs. But the trouble became apparent from very early on that some strange dynamics going on. This is another female. So we saw this plover's mate, and we saw this female, and we saw another male, but almost all the time, this secondary female was hanging around this nest and making the plover who was on the nest quite nervous, visibly nervous. There's a lot of this kind of jockeying for position and fighting, and some of that's very normal. They like to have a breeding area territory that's they feel is the right size for them, and they need to be far away enough from other nests. And they're fighting, oftentimes for the very best spot. But usually that goes on for a little while, and then everything settles down. What happened this year is that it never settled down between these 2 pairs. So, and also that's a least tern up above. There's pressure from least terns when they arrived and started nesting as well. These 2 pairs of plovers had a lot of stress and strain trying to dominate this one area. We tried to give them a lot of room and let them do what they needed to do. The secondary female started her own nest, got washed out. She started a second one, but the second one was pretty close, really right away. I see in our notes that we said is about as close as could possibly be tolerated. And it, in the end, was not tolerated. We began to see really strange behaviors, and we began to think those aren't rocks sitting in front of that bird. These are eggs, and that's utterly unusual. Normally, all those 4 eggs fit in together, and the bird completely covers them up, like you could see with 36P. So we began to really worry. And at one point when both mates were away from the nest, my co-monitor, Diane Fletcher, got in close enough with a big lens and saw that there were 7 eggs in the nest. And there's just no way they can cover them. And they just don't do that. So we began to realize that this dynamic between these pairs included egg dumping. So this one female who was causing so much trouble was basically jumping on the nest of the first female whenever it was unguarded and laying her own eggs in it. So this, by the time we took this photograph, the nest was already a week overdue. We in the log, know what day it's supposed to hatch, and it wasn't hatching. And so we began to just think, well, all those eggs are duds. Then 2 of them did hatch, and then the rest of them, the 5, did not. And so the plover pair kept trying to incubate the 4 incubatable eggs. And the 2 chicks that were hatched were virtually entirely neglected. Sadly, what you see here is one dead or dying chick, and this other one just standing there going, dude, what do I do? I'm hatched, and now what happens? And had no guidance, no protection, scarcely ever saw them brooding them or showing them what to do. And so they were just not parented at all. Meanwhile, you can see these all four, they're just jumping off the nest and running all around. It's like a perennial circus or square dance going on. You could not go to the beach without seeing just a frenzy of squawking and fluttering and a great deal of activity, quite the opposite of the normal behavior, which by this time of the year, it's very quiet. It's hard to find them. It's and that's how they survive and how they're able to reproduce, is by having a really low profile. And this was the opposite of that. So very destructive, really. And here's, the sad remains of 5 unviable eggs, and this sort of dried up husk of a dead plover chick. It was so depressing for us and so terrible and just heartbreaking. Real, and we needed to figure out, well, we searched our own souls to make sure we hadn't contributed to it. And because we were so careful from the get-go, we were all sure that, because they seemed so crazy, we just gave them a ton of room. And we're pretty sure that just having maybe inexperienced parents and not quite enough room, and a couple of high tides at bad times, sort of condensing the space too much, and basically sea level rise, caused this really rough year for us. And then eventually all the eggs, and not just from that nest, but also the eggs, most of the eggs and most of the chicks of the lease terns, who I've scarcely even talked about, were cleared off the beach in 2 nights, excuse me, by a fox, red fox. You can see the fracas that occurred here between many small birds and red foxes over the course of 2 nights, and sadly our killdeer as well. So 2 days short of hatching, our killdeer nests were also wiped out by these predators. But in a way, it's hard not to think that all that fluttering and just all that distraction, crazy distraction, just made them irresistible to predators. So on a better note, here's 36P with a somewhat adolescent chick who's growing up, and all 4 of those chicks from that clutch fledged, and we hope that we'll see them again maybe next year. We won't be able to recognize them, any of them, unfortunately, except for 36P if he returns, and we hope he does because he's such an overachiever. It's such a treat for us to actually be able to fully recognize one plover from one year to the next, because we get you can see very deep connection, very sort of parental feeling to them ourselves. And as much as we try to be scientists, we're also citizens, and that means we kind of fall for these guys pretty hard each year. So that's all I have to say. I hope that you'll have some questions for Catherine in particular, because she's the knowledgeable one here.
Thank you, Paula. That was excellent. So if anybody has any questions, feel free at this time to put them into the chat box, and we'll answer them to the best of our abilities. I'll give it a few moments. I still see we have most people still here. So yeah, if you have a question, just throw it in the text box and one of the three of us will answer it. No worries if you don't. No problem.
I can see a question there from Ellen Russell. What else besides oysters do oyster catchers eat?
Yeah, they eat other shellfish and also other invertebrates. So they might be eating some nice big polychaetes on the beach, as well as maybe blue mussels and spat and other kinds of invertebrates that are not as small, not the little fleas and the tiny little invertebrates that plovers eat, but bigger things that are meatier.
So it'd be my fondest wish to have oyster catchers breeding in Ellisville. What would they need that we don't have?
Well, I guess one thing I would say is that Ellisville is such a rich area with biodiversity also in the predator class. You have so many fantastic pictures that I've seen over the years of foxes and coyotes, and you have lots of crows, and so it's a struggle there with all the predators that you have. The marsh is, I think, such a rich place. The oyster catchers would need a little island. I think they need to have some distance between the ground predators.
So I have a question here. Is the closing of the gate time to coincide with the plover's presence? I would say yes, it directly is, because we open it back up. The plovers tend to leave in late August, maybe the first week of September. So that is exactly right. Yeah. And we have another question. Do you intend to do any banding of plovers around here? Catherine, I think you might be best suited to answer that.
Mass Audubon has not done any banding of plovers to my knowledge ever. They were banded quite a bit in the very first years when they were listed in order to get a lot of baseline information about them, way back in the 80s. They found out that the way that they were being banded and the bands they were using were contributing to leg injury problems. And so it was like cut off completely. And only in the last 4 or 5 years has permission been granted within the state, although it, like Beulah was banded by the Canadian Wildlife Service in the Bahamas. So there are other entities around the bird's range where banding is more common, but it's been only recently that there's been some banding on Monomoy at the National Wildlife Refuge and a couple of other places, but and now they figured out how to keep the birds from having those leg injuries. We are hoping to band American oyster catchers in the Boston Harbor area this year, so we're very excited about that. That'll be fun. They're easy to recite, so it's fun.
Question for either you, Catherine, or Paula. How common is that unusual behavior Paula shared?
I think it's pretty unusual. I don't think it's unprecedented, but one thing that Paul and I discussed a couple days ago is that 2019 was one of the very best productivity years for piping plover on record. The whole state, in fact, the whole New England region had extremely high reproductive success for their piping plovers, and the birds breed as 1-year-olds. So I think Paul is right on that she had some young birds potentially that came in and were like trying to figure things out. And so it'll be interesting to hear more from the state. The state hasn't issued its final report for 2020 for us to understand better how that bumper crop of plovers in 2019 might have had the same kind of crowding issues or like, kind of immature behavior, basically. It'll be interesting to see if there are other examples of that, but it's pretty unusual, especially for 2 females. It's more likely to have a mated pair and then like a male hanging around rather than, and I know, Paula, you had two pairs, and I guess they were both mated pairs, but I think it's unusual.
So we have a question about, so someone was curious about the photo that showed the channel diverted from the access to the marsh. It seems the last time they were there that it had been dredged to go straight out to the jetty. How does that affect the nesting area? It's
interesting. I think that the less that it's dredged, or occasionally maintenance needs to be done, because the channel just closes up fully, and the water doesn't come or go anymore, or rarely does. And you'll have the tides basically never go out or never come in for over the course of many days or months in some cases. And then the inlet diverts in various crazy ways. And that's probably caused by the jetties that are already there. So it's a something that's caused by other human interactions down the line, or human actions. But there's a lot of sand that piles over that jetty and creates sort of the base of a spit. And sometimes we've had very successful nests up there because it's very high, it doesn't overwash. If we've lost them, it tends to be to predators. So some of that territory that's caused by the overwash of sand is actually useful for the plovers. But it's hard to know fully, because each season the beach is quite different every year. And it's very interesting to hear Kathy's talk about how that change, that dynamic system, it really favors the plovers. And it makes me happy to hear that, actually, because the system is extremely dynamic.
Yeah. Right.
All right, so I have a question that asks, does the state park, which DCR manages, do they have an agreement with Wildlands pertaining to dog rules? I do believe that dogs aren't allowed. There are plovers on the state park off and on, and I don't know their exact rules, to be honest, and how they manage their land. But we do educate anyone who comes into our land from the south. But that is something that we could definitely maybe communicate more proactively with DCR and see sort of what they're doing. So that's my answer to that question. If anyone else from the Friends has any more knowledge of that, please feel free to answer. But that's the only thing I would say.
I can enlarge on that a little bit. So Mass Audubon has the contract to manage the state side of that system, along with a bunch of other state beaches in the state, and that park, as everybody knows, isn't staffed, and so there's little DCR presence there, unfortunately. DCR has a statewide ban of dogs on beaches starting April 1st and going through the end of August. So dogs are not supposed to be on the beach during the nesting season at all. There's mixed messaging, unfortunately, with the signage, because you can get down from the state park end and you'll get at the bottom of where the stairs used to be, and it says, please pick up after your dog. So that's not the right message. And of course, dogs are allowed up on top where there's a nice area to run your dog, and dogs, it's perfectly fine for dogs to be up there. And I know that that park is on social media as a dog friendly park, which it is. It's just the beach that we want to keep the dogs off of. So that's a really tricky one. It's been, and I know Eric has been eternally frustrated by the way that works. And we keep working on it. It's been difficult. And then through the pandemic, there's even less presence of DCR on that particular beach. So we're working on that one. The 6-year-old watching, I love that question. Yes, the raccoons and the skunks and the coyotes and the foxes and the crows, those are all natural predators, and they all belong in the environment just the way piping plovers do. Cats and dogs are domestic animals, and dogs are great if they're kept under control. Cats are great if they're kept inside the house. But one of the tricky things for our natural predators is that they are in our environment at higher numbers than you would expect, or you would expect a sort of a natural environment to support them. So there's more of those, and there are fewer piping plovers. So that's kind of where the equation is a little out of balance. Just as you can imagine, natural predators, especially things like crows, are so smart about finding additional, sources of food and things like that, that they're very successful in our environment.
Does anyone else have any other questions at all?
There's one more about the channel.
Yeah, I can take that one, Eric.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's the major job of the Friendsville Marsh is to maintain the inlet. We have all the permits to do that on an ongoing basis. And basically, once that spit that's been discussed elongates the channel to a distance of about 900 feet, after that, scientific modeling has suggested that there will be negative impacts on the inside of the marsh. So as Paula mentioned, there's always this balancing act between, letting the spit form, but not get long enough to damage the ecosystems inside the marsh. So, what we do, our board makes a decision by February 15th of every year as to whether the conditions exist such that we should actually bring in the contractor and straighten the inlet. So that's what happens. It's not, Ellen is an authority on this. It's not just that it dries out the marsh, it changes salinity, water quality. Some sand gets sucked into the marsh and starts shoaling in what used to be the old harbor. It's a complicated issue, but the plovers and the nesting and the lease terms are something that we consider when we try to maintain that fine balancing act.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. Does anyone else have any other questions? No? I'll give it one more moment and then we'll wrap up. All right. So first off, I want to thank Catherine and Paula for your excellent presentations, and Eric, thank you also for sort of putting the idea out there for this. It's something that I would love to do on an annual basis for sure. So thank you so much, everybody, for attending, and hopefully I'll see some of you out there at Shifting Lots in the coming months. So thank you and good night, everybody.